Welcome to On Deck again. We are now in a different studio space. We are at Luke Molver's humble abode. Luke's a comic book artist and illustrator and writer. Tell us a bit more about yourself, dude.
Well, thank you for having me on deck. It's a pleasure to be here, and welcome to my humble abode where the magic happens, the art is created, the scripts are written, and a variety of other creative endeavors take place. I dabble in a lot of various forms of art as passion and as therapy. I started from a very early age. I always had a love of storytelling, nurtured by my parents and grandparents reading me bedtime stories, which went from the grim fairy tales to the Greek myths to the tales of the Norse gods. So that was a love of storytelling and world building and fantasy worlds was cultivated in me from a very early age. And combined with a passion for art. Again, from an early age, I scribbled pictures. I drew monsters on the page. You know, I was a bit of a lonely kid, a little bit of a weird kid. From preschool, the teachers called my mum in because they were concerned about the monstrous chimerical hybrids I was drawing while sitting alone in the corner of the playground, and everyone else was playing kissing catches. But my mother, bless her heart, she just said, "Don't worry about my son. He's got an imagination. He'll be fine." And my mum was right. I think I'm fortunate in the regard that I've always had that very singular vision of what I wanted to do. From the time I could walk and talk and write and draw, I knew that those were the things I wanted to do. And as I grew older, that love of storytelling and that love of illustration and drawing and mark making, they combined into a love of comic books, which I found to be the most conducive medium to combine those two things. And like with many young people, I grew up with Marvel and DC superheroes, Garfield and Archie, all of the usual comics. But
Yeah, I was about to ask, what were the sort of significant influences or the sort of specific titles that encouraged you to become a comic book artist and illustrator and writer?
It was a very direct, specific moment that really just, it was that sort of, and it was when my father, who was a big sci-fi aficionado, he had a lot of that old school pulp literature, from Frank Herbert to Harry Harrison. You can see a lot of it in the room that we're in right now. I inherited all his library. And he cultivated that love of sci-fi, of other worlds, of aliens, of monsters. And it was when he brought me from a shop here in Durban. It's no longer around, but at that time we're talking 90s, sort of early to mid 90s. A shop called the Kilo Bookshop, which was exactly what it sounds like. You bought books in weight. And there were books there were magazines there that you could not find anywhere else. You didn't see them in CNA, you didn't see them in Adams. And he brought me a comic book called 2000 AD, which was a British sci-fi anthology. A lot of different artists and different writers. But up until then, I was predominantly exposed to, superheroes and comedic strip comics, Archie and Garfield and stuff. But seeing 2000 AD and seeing, the first thing that struck me was just the violence. There were just exit wounds all over the page. The way these panels were painted, each one was an individual artwork. And a lot of them were wordless, which was also something that struck me, the ability to tell a story just in panels. That story becomes transcendent, beyond language, beyond culture, beyond anything. You can understand it. But it was the content of these stories. It was the huge variety of art styles. It was the fact that they weren't all just, a house illustration like Marvel or DC. They were artists, they were creators, they were writers. They were all coming together to tell these amazing stories. A lot of them didn't involve superheroes at all. And it was 2000 AD. It was a lot of people might know Judge Dredd, which was the title character of 2000 AD. And that was the specific comic. I remember my dad bringing this comic back on one night, and I always look forward when I know he'd been to the bookstore, like, what's he going to bring? And I just knew at that moment, this is the kind of thing I want to do. Stories don't have to be about superheroes. They don't have to be funny. They can be, but they can also combine all of those elements. And that inspired a lot of my own work early on and continues to inspire it today. Funnily enough, 2000 AD, it came out in 1977. And I don't think they thought that it would go on further than the year 2000 AD. But now we're 24 years after the date, the title date of the comic, and that comic is still going strong, So I think also there's a bit of there's a renaissance in comic books. They're no longer, they're called graphic novels now, if you will, but that's really just a marketing thing to sell more comic books. But we can see in Hollywood, like there's such a wealth of stories that Hollywood is now taking out and adapting for the silver screen.
So speaking of Hollywood, right? You also dabble in film, but we can get a sense that horror and science fiction has been sort of the foundation of what made you become a comic book artist, right, and writer. So what would you, who would you reference as your key players or films that had influenced you?
Well, I think if I can just touch on the idea of genre, specifically horror and sci-fi, before getting into the specific inspirations, I often think that genre itself is often used more to market a story than what a story may actually be. Because in horror and sci-fi and any genre really, I find the most powerful stories told in these genres are really stories about the human condition. The things that drive us, the base fears, the base loves, the base desires, Sci-fi has often been allegorical. I'm not just talking comics or films or literature, it's across the board, It's telling stories through a lens of aliens and other worlds, but they're really telling stories about us, about the human condition, about the issues we face as societies and as cultures. And horror, similarly, horror strips you down to worlds where, perhaps the normal rules of societal control no longer apply. Their morality plays. And I think the best works in those genres, and the best creators, they understand that. They understand that they're making, first and foremost, they're not telling genre tales, they're telling human tales that happen to fit into a genre. I would say specifically, going back to like my father's inspiration of all the sci-fi that he introduced me to. William Gibson's Neuromancer, the cyberpunk work of those early 80s authors, who really defined the semiotics and the iconography of the information age we live in now. We are in the cyberpunk dystopias, but it wasn't some grand cataclysm or apocalypse. It was a gradual slide into it.
Yeah.
And around the same time, 1982, there was Blade Runner, based on the work of Philip K. Dick, another big inspiration on my own work. So I cut my teeth, on sci-fi early on, later moving into horror. Obviously, guys like Stephen King, H.P. Lovecraft, John Carpenter, who the director, who also I really respect as a multi-hyphen, because he's a guy who writes, directs, scores, shoots his own work, operates in much the same way I do. I perform my own creative endeavors. But I think all of these people that I mentioned, they understand what I said. They're telling stories They're telling stories about human conditions. And a lot of the time, in the case of Blade Runner, I mean, it's a story about replicants, but it's a story about the humanity that these replicants are seeking, you know. And that's always fascinates me, that tension between the man and the monster. On that note, I mean, we can go further back to stuff like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein.
Or Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.
Exactly. All of that stuff, regardless of the genre that was placed in at the time or the genre that we consider it now, I think those stories are powerful and have lasted so long in public and popular consciousness because they're tales of the human condition. And I think sometimes that's an issue. That's a problem with pop culture now, because we're forgetting that. We are catering far too much to you know, fan service, to corporate approved, market tested, formula driven product. We're not making art anymore. We're making product. And that should be more alarming to everyone than it is. Well, specific inspirations, I think, as we mentioned, I appreciate a good multi-hyphenate creator, guys like John Carpenter, you know, the authors I mentioned, William Gibson, Philip K. Dick. I'm also quite inspired by music, obviously, as we all are. I'm less up to date on contemporary tunes, but some of those old school dudes really inspire a lot of my work, because I think music can be quite visual, you know, lyrically, obviously, but also, you know, the music itself. A great inspiration on my work is Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds, which is the name of his band, but Nick Cave himself is also an author, an artist. He dabbles in a variety of creative pursuits. And his career spans, you know, from the early 80s to present day, and it's changed. His work has changed. He has been through drug addiction, personal tragedy, you know, the loss of children. And personally, I really like that early work. You know, that raw-edged heroin junkie living in a filthy drunken loft in Berlin stuff. He's grown up and matured, but you know, I think there was something dangerously pure about his early work, and I think you can say that about any artist or any filmmaker or any creator. And the nature of life, the nature of the human condition, as we evolve and we mature and we change. But the fact that a guy like Nick Cave, John Carpenter, whoever, they're still making work, indicates to me that they're not doing it. You mentioned giving back. You mentioned what does one do to give back, to pay homage to, and I appreciate that. But I think there's a point where the best way you can give back is not give in to any sort of fan service. Art, by its base nature, for me, is something personal, something passionate, something that you have to do for yourself before you do it for anyone else. I jokingly said when we began, you know, the art is therapy, and it is. And I think if you use that as a baseline for your own personal creative endeavors, you will draw people, the right audience, the right fans to your work, because they love your work, not because you're thinking, oh, what trend should I follow? Ooh, how can I please the audience? You know, you're doing work that means something to you, and the audience can tell that.
Yeah.
They understand that passion, and that's what draws them to it. David Bowie, another great singular musician, visionary creator, creative force, you know. He said something in an interview in the 60s or 70s at some point. He said, I paraphrase, but he said, when an artist starts doing work that caters to an audience's perceptions of that artist, they are doing their worst work. And he didn't use the words fan service, but that's what he was talking about in the 70s. And again, like I mentioned, I think that is an issue that is becoming more dangerous now. The idea that artists or content creators, as they call themselves. Let's break that term down for a second, which I have a great problem with that term because it means nothing. Content creator, what is that? Content, the word, there's two meanings to it. Content is something that fills something else up. It's also a state of being that is just
happy.
I'm okay.
Yeah.
I'm content. I've got nothing on the horizon. I'm just going to, rest on these laurels. So the idea of a content creator is just such a repellent term for me. And when an artist is calling themselves a content creator, they should think more carefully about what they're naming themselves. So that wasn't a term 10 years ago. It certainly wasn't a term when Bowie was around. You know. So the iconography and the terminology of the age we're living in. Graphic novel is another one. Graphic novel is a term that was created by a marketing exec in a basement somewhere to sell more comic books. Because comic books, the medium of comics, they are more than the sum of those two parts. They are a car is 4 wheels and an engine, but you put them together, it's a car. It's not just those two things. So while comics share things in common with graphics and things in common with novels, you put them together, they're more than that. We don't call cinema moving pictures. That's what it is, but it's more than that. So to go back to your question originally, homage, giving back, I think the best way to do that, and the way I try and do it, is do work that helps me, that filters the often senseless nature of our existence as humans, and it filters that and it helps me work through that. And the people, the audience, the fans who enjoy my work and recognize that work, I value them more than anyone I have pandered to, more than any trend I've followed or service I've rendered in the name of content creation.
Okay. So let's talk about creative evolution. What was probably one of your most therapeutic pieces of work that you worked on?
In my comics, a lot of the time, it's an isolationist pursuit. I work alone, I write it, I draw it. The comic book industry, such as it is in South Africa, is so minimal. I mean, there's a lot of talent and there's a lot of passion and there's a lot of creators, but there's no infrastructure for it. I mean, it's not like we have comics publishing houses here. So specifically the comic book work I do is, I do it for myself, like my recent comic, Sunday Slave, I hawk it mostly out of my backpack at bars that I visit or to people who know me. I've got it in one or two bookshops. They're all therapeutic works. I think one of the most important ones that I'm grateful for the opportunity was a series of comic books I wrote and illustrated on the Zulu King Shaka, which came out 2018, 2019. A subject that I wouldn't ordinarily have tackled on my own because there's a lot of cultural and political weight to the character of Shaka and the man of Shaka, because that's an interesting thing about Shaka Zulu, is that there's almost as much myth to the legend as there is factual history. But I was approached by a publisher who was familiar with my work, my writing, my art, to tell the story, to put it together and to write it. And there was a lot of research involved, there was a lot of fact-checking, but there was a lot of creative license. There are numerous retellings of the story of Shaka because there's no real baseline for the fact other than the sort of diaries of white settlers who kind of glamorized themselves in their retellings. So for that, those comic books, I consulted a lot of different sources, current, contemporary, and historical, and it was really. I was grateful. I was thankful to have that opportunity because I was a little concerned initially when the comics came out. They were released overseas first, and then they were released locally. And I was worried, I might get a bit of backlash. I'm aware of my positionality as a cis white male writing an entirely black cast of characters. But what this touches on what you were saying in the previous question about giving back, about a homage. I was humbled by the reactions that I got internationally. It won awards internationally, and even more importantly, locally. The comic books were marketed as both entertainment but also educational tools. There was a glossary of terms, there was cultural references at the back, which I also put together. I was very careful about it. And those books, the feedback I'm still getting is just amazing. I mean, they're being taught in schools. There's an exhibition next year in Abu Dhabi that's involves. They asked if they could use my Shaka work. They're combining it with Black Panther, a lot of Marvel and DC, a couple of French artists. You know, I got an email from a woman teaching a GED program in a prison in Alabama or Arizona, somewhere in America, and she sent me an email. And she was like, "I just want to tell you that the prisoners are going nuts for your books." And I think it is also worth noting the majority of the American prison population is young black male. But all of that was it was humbling is the word I can use. And like, as I've said, you know, I don't do the work for anyone else. It might sound selfish, but first and foremost, I'm creating art for me. But getting that sort of feedback, getting that sort of reaction, it speaks to exactly what I mentioned. You do the work, you do the research, you put in the effort and the passion, and the responses, they give you things that you couldn't possibly imagine. The rewards are inconceivable.
As Quentin Tarantino says, I make my movies for me. Everybody else is invited. You know.
Yeah, I think Tony Montana said something similar. You know, you got to make your own moves in this world.
So let's use. You mentioned something about Sunday Slave, which was your most recent comic book, right? And you had the launch recently, which was quite overwhelmingly successful.
Yes, yeah, surprisingly so.
At Ike's Bookstore in Florida Road. So tell us a little bit about Sunday Slave.
Well, Sunday Slave is also, it's loosely based on the legend of Robert Johnson, the blues musician who made a deal with the devil at a midnight crossroads. It also touches on what I spoke about, like how music can inspire a variety of other art forms. I'm a big fan of the blues. For the reasons that I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of narrative content. There's a lot of lyrical wealth in blues music, I find. And a lot of it is born out of, you know, oppression and poverty and slavery. But the storytelling traditions, often oral storytelling traditions, similarly to the way the Shaka comic, you know, the idea of how the stories of Shaka and the early Zulu legends came about, they were oral storytelling traditions. Similarly, you know, Sunday Slave is set in a kind of anachronistic deep South America. I've never been to that area, but I did the requisite research, and you can get away with as long as you're not directly saying it's a factual representation, you can always get away with a bit of creative leeway, as long as you're respectful to the content, you know, to the characters that you're creating. But Sunday Slave was heavily inspired by blues music, and I involved it. I mean, it's ostensibly a horror western, you know, because I pull in a lot of other different mythologies, both, you know, Eastern, Western.
So it runs into folk genre almost, yeah.
Folk horror, Southern Gothic, Old West kind of stuff, but inspired by the music itself. You know, I've got a little recommended listening list in each comic book. Also, the as I mentioned, like a lot of my early work was science fiction, which was more just extrapolating visual styles and technology from where we are now. But Sunday Slave is a period piece. So I got to do guys in fedora hats and, you know, like old six-shooters and waistcoats and bolo ties and stuff. So just from an artistic perspective, it was a lot of fun to draw that sort of thing, because I hadn't really drawn that before. And the launch itself was, well, you were there. It was so well attended. I mean, again, similarly to the response to Shaka, I got there, I was like worried that I was going to, 10 people might arrive and maybe 5 of them might buy a comic if I'm lucky. But but people came. I have fans apparently, and people enjoyed the comic. As a note, the best gift you could ever give me, my audience, my fans out there, the best gift I can ever get is feedback. Just read my work and tell me what you think. If you hate it, tell me. Tell me why. If you love it, tell me why. It's just, that's the best thing. I think any artist, any creator, any writer, any filmmaker can desire, right? It's feedback.
Yeah.
I know I've said that, I do it for myself, but nevertheless, I still, if people do dig it or hate it, I want to know. I want to know why. I will always take suggestions or critiques. I will always take them under advisement. I think as a creator, you have to. It's your responsibility. Every work I've done, every film I've made, every comic book I've written, every song I've penned, every piece of music I've played, they all come from inside me. But once they're out there, they're out there. And if other people attach themselves to them, or they attach themselves to other people, I want to hear about it. I want to know, because that does mean something.